Merci bien, Nico Shuntis.
Thank you very much, Nico Huntis. Thank you to Sofia Sakorafa. Thank you, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who's not here at the moment, but who certainly supports this event. Thank you to the whole GUE NGL group. I'd like to also thank the members of the European Parliament, even if they're not members of the GUE group, who are nevertheless here, like Eva Joly from the group of Greens. And also, we in the Greek Parliament, we have received people for the Truth Committee to testify and follow. Thank you to all of those who've come from Brazil, from Ecuador, Greece, France, Spain, Cyprus, and indeed other countries. And thank you to every one of you who are here, more than 120 people here in this room. I've often come to this sort of meeting in the European Parliament, and I've seldom seen the ranks so full, which obviously shows the clear interest that there is in this subject. And I certainly hope that the streaming and the products that we'll get from recording this event will be widely disseminated. Zoe Constantopoulou talked about the history of the committee, and I, as her, would like to refer to the history of this too. Let's not forget that Sofia Sakorafa, who's here, when she was a member of the PASOK party in 2010, was actually against the memorandum. In December 2010, she suggested the establishment of an audit committee within the framework of the Greek Parliament, and she referred to the experience that had been seen by Ecuador in 2007-2008. I was involved in that, along with Diego Borca, who's here in the room, a former finance minister of Ecuador and former governor of the Central Bank of Ecuador, who also worked in our committee during the course of 2015. In 2010 as well, friends of ours such as Leonidas Vakiotis, who's here, or Aristofino, also started working on the film Hypocrisy, which came out in 2011, saw massive success in Greece, but also on the international stage, because that was translated as well. Those filmmakers here as well. March 2011, the Citizens' Debt Committee was formed, with a very important faction included of people who then continued their efforts in the framework of the Audit Commission, which had been established thanks to the decision of the Speaker of the Greek Parliament, Zoe Constantopoulou, which started its work as of April 2015. As Zoe said, there has been a continuity between initiatives that have been taken by the social movements and by militants as well in the political sphere. And the translation of that into an act under one of the powers of state, the legislator. So that's a first in Europe. It's not a first in countries such as those in Latin America, but it's a first for Europe. And maybe I can recall that to date that is the only concrete form of a regulation adopted in Europe by the European Parliament, a regulation which, by the way, is not very good, 472, which in its Article 7 has a stipulation which was probably the only positive point there, and it's actually the only one that's ever been applied since this was adopted by the European Parliament on the 21st of May 2013. So Article 7, paragraph 9, which says that a state subject to financial assistance has to carry out an audit of that debt in order to explain why the debt has become unsustainable and explaining any irregularities that may have occurred. The Commission has never demanded that the Portuguese government, the Greek government, the Cypriot government, the Irish government, or the Spanish government who are subject to this form of financial assistance that this Article 7 be applied to them. And it's important to repeat this once again here, to underscore that, to denounce this sort of hypocritical attitude which seems to characterize all of the acts of the European Commission. Moving on to the work that we've done, because I don't have a lot of time, I think that one of the fundamental revelations that Zoe passed over quite quickly is one I'd like to dwell on a little longer. We've seen lies from the start, lies to public opinion in Europe and public opinion in Greece. There has been a deliberate, when I say there has been, I mean the Greek authorities with the Prime Minister at the time, Georges Papandreou, Jean-Claude Trichet, who was running the European Central Bank, Dominique Strauss-Kahn, who was the General Director of the International Monetary Fund. We're talking about Barroso, who was heading the European Commission at the time. There's been connivance here to adopt a narrative of Greek debt crisis which runs completely counter to reality. Now, you may recall the explanations that were given at the time. Greek public debt, according to these celebrities and institutions I've just cited, has reached an unsustainable level as a result of an accumulation of public debt which is too high, notably as a result of an over-generous social payment system, a pension system that's far too beneficial for Greek retirees, a lack of collecting taxation. That was the official line. But the truth, and this is something we've proven in our report now, is that the explosion of the Greek debt situation is not an explosion of public debt that strikes us. There was an explosion of debt, but it was an explosion of private debt. And that really puts us in a situation that doesn't only concern Greece. At the start of the year of the 2000s, there was an excess of liquidity at the disposal of the big European banks, most notably the French and German banks, and other so-called central economic powers, Benelux, Austria, the Italian bank as well. And these big banks, in the case of Greece, it was actually French and German banks more particularly, managed to pump in massive amounts of liquidity to Greece. And this coincided with Greece joining the euro, because the big German and French banks were sure that if there were any problems, there would not be any devaluation or any loss, because everybody was now in the eurozone. And secondly, because the loans, the massive loans that they were paying to Greeks, mainly private institutions, but public ones as well, would be guaranteed subsequently by the European Central Bank, and the European Commission and the European Central Bank would always make sure that if push came to shove, the creditors would be bailed out. And that's basically what happened. So we saw a massive influx of capital. I said this happened in Greece. It happened in Ireland as well. It happened in Portugal. It happened in Spain, with an influx of capital from German banks onto the Spanish real estate market. So this wasn't peculiar to Greece at the time. There was a phenomenon here that was seen, has been seen elsewhere in the past, but in the 2000s we saw capital influxes that were coming from the centre to the periphery. And as we've seen in the past, at a certain stage, those flows from the centre to the periphery stop. Often for the reasons that the countries at the centre decide on, not necessarily linked to the circumstances of the countries in the peripheral. So we saw a massive increase in private debt, and you'll say, well, who was running up the debt? Who were the private individuals running up this private debt? Well, it was private banks, Greek banks, taking the loans from Greek and French banks. Then it was the various households in Greece who were taking direct loans from French and German banks, non-financial enterprises also loaning massive amounts of money from abroad. And that obviously led to public debt as well, which was accumulating, as Zoe said, as a result, inter alia, of extensive military spending for armaments provisions, which tend to be private French and German armaments providers, North American arms dealers as well. Of course, it's not only that, but the critical situation at the end of 2009-2010, it wasn't a question of a default risk on a payment of its public debt. The risk was an inability of the different Greek interests who'd run up the debt to carry on their payments. So at the end of 2009-2010, the payments defaults, i.e. the difficulties that Greek companies and to an extent households of repayment because of the depression that had kicked in at the end of 2009-2010 in Greece, which had started earlier in France and Germany, which really sowed panic in the international institutions. If private individuals and companies were starting to have problems in repaying their debt, and if it's simplifying things, what sort of ramifications would there be on the German and French banks who'd lent to such huge extents? And what would be the consequences for the American banks, also closely implicated in what's been going on with the European banks as well? You may not remember, but there was systematic telephone conversations between Sarkozy, Merkel and Obama in 2010, between Obama and Strauss-Kahn. The US itself weighed in to support the memorandum, and because the American banks could be affected or infected by the contagion because of the French and German banks being destabilized, because of the close links between American banks and European banks of that nature. In order to explain the necessity to come up with 110 billion for Greece to save the Greek financial system and the French and German financial systems as well, there had to be a narrative which was acceptable and palatable to public opinion. It was impossible in 2010 for the European authorities and the IMF authorities to say that we were going to save the bankers. We'd already been doing that since 2007-2008. Public opinion had enough of that. They had to come up with a new narrative, and they created that narrative, and that is that the public institutions in Greece had spent too much. It was basically a socialist setup in Greece. You remember the discourse of the time. And Papandreou, at the time, falsified Greek statistics and concluded an agreement, and we've mentioned this very clearly in our report, with the National Statistics Office in Greece to exaggerate the deficit of the Greek state in order to increase the levels of Greek debt, to increase the percentage of Greek debt vis-à-vis the GDP by integrating into Greek debt aspects that should not have been integrated therein and that were running counter to Eurostat norms and standards. So we had this narrative which was a lie, but linked into acts of pure and simple falsification of Greek statistics, which should lead to legal action, denunciation with very clear evidence that we have set out in our report. The creditors were fully aware of what I've just told you. In inventing this narrative, they knew they were lying. One of the documents that we have seen that was made available to us by the Speaker of the Greek Parliament, where certain legal cases were declassified, secret documents coming from the International Monetary Fund, for example, one of those documents was a verbatim record of the IMF meeting from the 9th of May 2010. We have this in extenso set of minutes. You can see it on our CADTM internet site, and there are on others as well. We've scanned that document. It says secret, it says confidential, but you can read it anyway. There's no problem. So what does it say? Well, you'll see that there a good number, over 10 directors who were present, of the 24 present, who were saying that the support provided by the IMF was for French and German banks. And the one that's named clearest is the executive director of Brazil, but other executive directors have also said it, including the executive director of Switzerland. And as these executive directors of the IMF have been denouncing the form of support that was being provided by the IMF, the 30 billion that the IMF was paying within that 110 billion provided, the French, German and Dutch executive directives confirmed, and it's in the minutes officially, they said that we guarantee that our bankers, French, German, Dutch bankers, will not sell Greek securities on the secondary market. Our bankers will remain exposed to the Greek situation as they are today. So the French, German and Dutch executive directors lied to their own colleagues to be able to convince them that despite the reluctance, they should vote through this IMF loan. In this document, you'll also see that several executive directors denounce the fact that in a tacit way, at this meeting, the Director General of the IMF changed the rules of procedure concerning the conditions under which you can authorize a loan to a country requesting it. To date, the IMF could only lend to a country if, through providing that loan, the debt would become sustainable. Because they are fully aware in providing a loan of 30 billion, the debt in Greece would not become sustainable. In fact, would become more unsustainable. They changed the rules of the game. And that is reflected in the minutes that I'm talking about. They've changed the criteria. They've swapped one criterion for another. For example, the one saying that there might be a financial banking crisis triggered by the lack of provision of the loan. And that is what I've said proves what was being said elsewhere. The fear of what would happen to the French and German banks, which had provided far too much liquidity to Greece, basically to make a massive profit without applying due diligence and by restricting loans to Greek recipients. So in these minutes, you'll see very clearly that the management is saying, well, yes, we have actually changed the rules at the start of the meeting without actually saying it, because it wasn't subject to a vote, and that's been denounced and then accepted in the framework of the minutes because there was a crisis situation, because if the IMF didn't adopt that vis-à-vis the IMF executive directors, you would have seen a new Lehman Brothers that could have triggered even greater cataclysmic effects than what we saw in 2008 with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. So I wanted to just take some time looking at that, because the narrative of this crisis is absolutely fundamental. Of course, the report has a great deal of other aspects and elements. It shows that the loans that were extended were carried out under a form that violates the Greek constitution, as I'm sure Georgios Kasimatis will mention, that the conditions mention explicitly certain aspects which show that there have been violation of international treaties that these institutions were bound by, and the Greek authorities too. We can show that in our Chapter 6 by showing clearly that the creditors' demands have been translated by these measures taken, dictated to the Greek authorities. The consequences are X, Y, and Z in terms of the violation of these measures, these stipulations, those treaties. And the final part of the report sets out arguments for the Greek authorities to use the following line of argument. International law allows states faced with an unfair attitude, a dishonest attitude of creditors in terms of repayment conditions. International law allows states to take recourse to countermeasures, as they're called. Maybe, if I can put it in layman's terms, unilateral self-defense measures. So unilateral self-defense measures which might constitute a suspension of payments, a rupture of contract, abrogation of contract, so a suspension of payment, but also to declare a contract null and void given the stipulations which are included therein, which prove the odious nature and illegal nature of the aforementioned contract. So in our report we have set out a number of aspects which would have allowed the Greek government to use those acts to support the idea of taking self-defense unilateral measures vis-à-vis the creditors. But I know in the future a new Greek government might pick up on our work. And in the meantime, in Greek public opinion and international public opinion, these things will come to light. This report will elucidate what's been going on. The report that came out in September will be looked at. We will analyse the report that we are in the process of drawing up, as I was saying, about Greek and international banks, that is going to be published in the coming weeks and that we'll be able to talk about during the course of the press conference at 5 p.m. today, by telling you a few things that you probably are not aware of. So make sure you're there at 5 p.m. Thank you for your attention.